Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic.
I'm Barry P. Cook. I'm here to talk about the latest episode of The Last of Us on hbomax. It was called Long Time. This is a pretty long episode. It was like an hour and 20 minutes. And if you've already seen the episode and you want to skip the breakdown and get to the part where I talk about what I thought about the episode, you can do that. I'm going to put a time code up on the screen that you can skip to. Before I get going, I just want to say if you would give the video a like, that would be great. If you could share it, that would be even better. Of course, subscribe to the channel. That really helps me out. And, make a comment. That helps too. And I like talking with folks about these things that we go over in my videos. Okay, so this episode was called Long Time, which is, I guess, the name of or a lyric from a Linda Ronstadt song. As it begins, Joel is in some kind of mountainous, foresty region down near a stream with Ellie. And I found it to be a little weird because they were only in Boston, Boston proper last week. So what's happening? Massachusetts has, woodsy areas, but I don't think there are mountainy regions in Massachusetts. I suppose there are, but I don't know. You don't see them often, at least on TV or whatever, when they're depicting Massachusetts. Anyway, maybe they're in Connecticut. Who knows? I don't know. Anyway, Ellie says she's never been in the woods before explaining to Joel that he chose to take her where she has to go because he wanted his truck battery, and that he shouldn't blame her for what happened to Tess. And he nods in agreement. As they're walking down the road adjacent to the woods, Ellie notices that Josh has a handgun in addition to his rifle, and she asks him if she can carry it, but he says no before she can even complete the question. Then they arrive at a safe house of sorts where Joel had stashed some stuff in the past so that he could retrieve some of it. And Ellie finds a hatch in the floor, which she then opens and descends through because that's not stupid. After she finds an old box of feminine hygiene products in the basement, I guess, she, of course, hears a zombie noise. And sure enough, there's a zombie buried in rubble across the room, which she then walks close to for some reason, and then proceeds to cut into with a knife because that's not incredibly fucking stupid. But then she wises up and decides to jam her knife through his brain, which, okay, good on you. She rejoins Joel, who apparently has found what he was looking for before leaving his rifle behind because there isn't a lot of ammo out in the world for it. They then come across a crashed jetliner, and Ellie explains, of course, that she's never flown. Ellie then asks Joel how it all happened, and this is a key part of the episode, or the key part of the series so far anyway. He explains that it happened when cordyceps, if I'm saying that correctly, which are a kind of fungi, got infected. We don't know how. And then got into the food supply, and that when foodstuffs that are available everywhere in the world went to market on a particular Thursday, everybody started getting infected, and then everything was undone. Civilization had fallen by the end of Sunday, which is crazy. They come across a patch of skeletons as they're walking, and apparently these were people who probably weren't even sick, but who were killed anyway when there wasn't any more room in the quarantine zones. And after having been rounded up to be taken to quarantine zones, there was no room, and they ended up just killing them, which is crazy. We then get a flashback to not long after Infection Day in 2003, and the military is collecting people ostensibly to take them to the quarantine zones, and one of them is wearing an outfit that is seen on one of the skeletons. As the military pulls out of this particular neighborhood, having evacuated everyone, it turns out that not quite everyone was evacuated because there's a guy holed up in a secret room in his basement with a whole bunch of guns and other survivalist type stuff. In the absence of anyone at all to stop him, he just kind of goes hog wild, stealing fuel from the nearest gas station by the barrel full, and stealing all manner of items from a local hardware store, as well as a bunch of alcohol from a liquor store. He then starts up a giant generator to give himself power in the absence of grid power, which of course has been shut off. He also seems to booby-trap his property, and they show that he has some chickens and some fresh kills hanging in a garage, so he's set up, I guess, for food and power and all that stuff. We then flash forward to 2007, which is 4 years later, and he's closed off like a whole neighborhood with a gated fence that operates on a code. Soon, a man falls into one of his traps and claims to be on his way to Boston from Baltimore by himself after the rest of his group of 10 all died. Our survivalist then checks him to see if he's infected and learns that he's not. It's weird because the guy in the trap, whose name is Frank, looks a lot more like Joel than Pedro Pascal does. So it was a little weird. But anyway, our survivalist lets him climb out of the hole on a ladder and tells him to keep going to Boston. But the guy asks if he could have some food. So our survivalist agrees to feed him. Then Frank discovers that our survivalist has a piano and he starts playing some Linda Ronstadt from a songbook that was in the piano bench, which doesn't sit well with our survivalist, who sits at the piano himself to play it and, of course, plays it better. When Frank asks him who the girl is that he was singing about while he was singing the Linda Ronstadt song, he says there is no girl. And Frank says he knows. And then they have a very scruffy bearded smooch, after which we learn that our survivalist's name is Bill and that he apparently really needs a shower. At this point, we now know both their names, Frank and Bill. Apparently, they were characters in the original The Last of Us game that I'd totally forgotten, and I guess that's why we're getting this particular story in this episode. Frank then takes said shower, and shenaniganery ensues. Next, it's 2010, 3 years later, and they're having some kind of argument because Frank wants to mow the lawn and paint the house or something, as well as fix up some of the stores because he plans to invite people to visit because he's found other survivors over the radio. And these other survivors turn out to be Joel and Tess. And it was interesting because Tess looks really, really healthy and really, really good, which is a huge contrast to how she had looked in the days before she died, which I guess speaks to how tough life got in the following years because it really wrecked her. Like to the point where I didn't recognize the actress from Fringe, but in these scenes I could say, oh, okay, yeah, that's the lady from Fringe. It was kind of interesting. Anyway, when Tess and Frank go walking around to look at stuff, I guess, Joel and Bill talk about how Frank and Bill really should continue interacting with them because they can help each other out, which, though Bill doesn't really think he needs to do, he actually does, because his fence is already starting to corrode and eventually raiding parties will come, but he still insists that they don't need help. Another 3 years later, in 2013, it turns out that Frank traded with Tess and Joe for a packet of seeds and he grew some strawberries. As Bill and Frank eat a couple of them, Bill is really moved by it and he tells Frank that he was never afraid before Bill showed up, but now he is because he's afraid of losing Frank. Sure enough, the raiders soon show up and they trip Bill's traps, which apparently include flamethrowers that activate on trigger wires and either mines or bombs as well. Bill goes out into the street to try and take on the raiders who can't get through the fence and he gets shot. Frank tries to take the bullet out, but as he's doing so, Bill's convinced he's dying and he tells him that he made copies of all the keys and that he should contact Joel, and then he passes out. The next thing we see, it's 2023, 10 years later, and that brings us up to speed with the Joel and Ellie timeline. Frank has apparently fallen ill and is wheelchair bound and has decided to end his life. He wants himself and Bill to get married before taking a bunch of pills crushed up in his wine by Bill and passing away, which Bill says he can't do, but then he does. They go to the boutique and get some nice clothes, and then they get married to each other, and they have a dinner, and Bill puts the crushed up pills in Frank's wine as he asked. But he also ingests a bunch of crushed pills himself, saying that he's old and Frank was his purpose, which Frank says he should be pissed about, but he's not because he finds it incredibly romantic from an objective point of view. And then they both kind of have a laugh as they hold hands. They then go off to bed, presumably to die, and then sometime later, Joel and Ellie show up. Joel notices that the potted plants outside Frank and Bill's place haven't been tended to, and he finds the door unlocked. Ellie finds a note that they left behind for Joel, which explains what happened, and that Joel can take whatever he wants. And he says in the note, Bill does, that he hated the world before and was happy when everyone died. But he discovered that Frank was worth saving, and so he protected him, which is, in his estimation, what people like he and Joel are in the world to do, protect people, which, of course, ties into the whole plot with Ellie. The note also came with a key, which goes to Bill's truck, which also seems to be missing a battery, which I thought was kind of funny, but Joel soon finds the components of a battery in a fridge next to the truck. So he builds the battery and he tells Ellie that once it's charged, they're going to go to Wyoming to find his brother, who used to be a firefly, and who can hopefully get her to wherever she's supposed to go. While nosing around in the house, Ellie finds a gun in a desk drawer and puts it in her bag, before Joel can see that she has it, because he doesn't want her to have a gun for some reason. Then they get in the truck and take off, and Ellie finds a tape in the glove box, and it's Linda Ronstadt. And as the episode ends, the song that Frank and Bill played on the piano earlier in the episode plays. So that's where the episode ended. This was an interesting episode. It reminded me a lot of some of the best Star Trek episodes, like The Visitor and The Inner Light, which are both great. And there was a lot about this episode to like as a story, a self-contained story. It speaks to the human spirit, what it is to be human, what humanity means, and how people are still people, even when they're the only two people in a whole town because of an apocalypse. And ultimately, that's what the Last of Us game was about, the human spirit and carrying on, enduring in the wake of disaster. There are a lot of zombie games on the market. Dead Rising is one of them. That is a good game, but it's not as cinematic as The Last of Us. Resident Evil is a zombie game. Again, that's not as cinematic as The Last of Us. The story is humans versus zombies, and that's pretty much all there is to it. But The Last of Us, and even Days Gone, which is sort of modeled after The Last of Us in terms of the story, is about people. It's about humanity. It's about the human condition. And the zombie part of it is almost secondary. It's the catalyst for the plot, but it isn't the plot. The plot is Joel and Ellie and, the raiders and slavers and what happens to humanity when disaster strikes. And it's about perseverance. And so that's what this whole episode was about. It was about how people are still people, even in the wake of something crazy. I'm glad they made it. I'm glad I watched it, but I do have to say I would have preferred another episode that heavily furthered the overall plot with Joel and Ellie. I'm someone that likes good stories if they're good stories. I don't care, I don't care if they aren't heavily woven into the narrative of a longer story that they might fit into so much. Like, I can handle a departure and watch a great story that's only connected tangentially to the larger story. But I don't know, I guess 3 episodes in, I wasn't ready for that. I wanted to see more about Joel and Ellie, and I want to see more zombies, man. I know I just made a big stink about how the game wasn't about zombies, but you want to see the zombies, man. You want to see them. The infected, I guess they're called this. Anyway, I don't have any complaints. It was a great story. I think I would have preferred it better as like an extra, you know what I'm saying? Like a bonus episode or something like that, or in graphic novel form, maybe, rather than taking up a whole episode of the series, because it's only going to be like 10 in the first season or whatever. But anyway, it's a minor complaint. This was a great episode of television, and it was a great love story. There's no denying that whatsoever. The only thing that was weird to me is that these guys never shaved. Like, it's 20 years. 20 years go by from the start of Bill's story to the end. And neither of these guys shaved ever. Like, and you could say, well, it was the apocalypse. Where are they going to shave? They had power. They had gas cooking. They ate very well. They did everything they wanted to do. They could take a shower with hot water. Didn't shave for 20 years. Why? I just thought that was weird. And it's not like they had 5 o'clock shadows. They had these thick, heavy beards. They didn't shave for 20 years. Apparently they got haircuts though. So that didn't make sense to me. But anyway, it's a minor thing that I just thought was funny. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the episode. I'm looking forward to next week. I will, of course, be back to review that episode once it is released. I'm going to get out of here for now. Until I return, I wish you peace and long life.